This is the battleship that helped start the Pacific War. From her bridge, the order was given to attack Pearl Harbor. For years, she stood as a symbol of Japanese naval power. But after Japan surrendered, the US Navy dragged her into a Pacific lagoon and tried to erase her with atomic bombs. Not once, twice, and somehow she refused to sink. Then, in the middle of the night, with nobody aboard and nobody watching, Nagato finally rolled over and vanished beneath the water. No battle, no final salute, just silence. Today, she still lies on the bottom of Bikini Atoll, one of the strangest endings any battleship has ever had. That is deep, but it is not out of reach, and that is exactly what makes this so strange. Plenty of wrecks in far worse condition have been pulled up from greater depths. So why has nobody, in nearly 80 years, ever gone back for her? The answer turned out to be stranger than I expected, and one piece of it is so ironic, I had to check it twice. But before we get to the bottom of that lagoon, you need to understand what kind of ship we are talking about. Because the Nagato was not just any battleship. When she was completed in 1920, she was the most powerful warship on the planet. She was the first battleship in the world to carry 16-inch guns, barrels 60 feet long, that could hurl a shell more than 20 miles. At 738 feet and nearly 47,000 tons fully loaded, she was a genuine engineering marvel, and Japan knew it. They were so protective of her that they classified her real top speed as a state secret for years. She became the symbol of Japanese naval power, the pride of an entire nation. And it was from the Nagato's bridge, as flagship of Admiral Yamamoto, that the order went out to strike the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. Now, here is what makes her truly remarkable. She fought through the whole war and came out the other side. By the time Japan surrendered, the Nagato was the only Japanese battleship still afloat. The Yamato, gone. The Musashi, gone. Every other capital ship Japan ever built lying at the bottom of the ocean. The Nagato had been to the Battle of Leyte Gulf. She had been swarmed by aircraft launched from 5 American carriers in the summer of 1945, and still, she refused to go down. When the war ended, American sailors made a point of boarding her before the surrender was even formally signed, and the Navy called the act a symbol of the complete defeat of the Japanese fleet. And then, they decided to blow her up. In July 1946, the Americans gathered a fleet of old and captured warships at Bikini Atoll and set off nuclear weapons in the middle of them. The program was called Operation Crossroads, and the Nagato was one of the star attractions. The first bomb, an airburst on the 1st of July, went off about 1,500 meters away, and the Nagato shrugged it off. Wrinkled plating, a few doors blown in, some scorched paint. That was it. In fact, a crew went back aboard afterward and fired up one of her boilers for 36 hours without a single problem. This was not the show the Americans had paid for. The whole point was to watch a nuclear weapon annihilate a warship. And instead, the most symbolic enemy ship in the harbor was just sitting there, barely scratched. So for the second test, they brought her in closer. For the Baker test on the 25th of July, the Nagato was anchored just 870 meters from ground zero, and this time the bomb went off underwater. A column of water more than a mile high erupted out of the lagoon and rained radioactive spray down across the entire fleet. And when the spray cleared, the Nagato was still floating. It gets better. The Navy's own records show they had actually strapped mines to her sides beforehand to help finish the job. And even that wasn't enough. She sat there with a list of barely 2 degrees. Once again, the ship the Americans most wanted on the bottom had refused to oblige. But Baker had done something the first bomb hadn't. It had soaked every surface of every ship in radioactive water. And the Nagato was now so contaminated that nobody could get within 1,000 yards of her. Sailors tried spraying her down from a distance to wash off the radiation. Nothing worked. So the Americans were left in an impossible position. They couldn't board her. They couldn't stop the slow flooding that had begun inside. All they could do was stand off at a safe distance and watch. 3 days after the test, the list had reached 8 degrees. Then it kept going. And on the night of the 29th of July, with no crew aboard, no ceremony, and not a single soul watching, the most famous warship in Japanese history quietly turned over and slipped beneath the surface. By morning, the patch of lagoon where she had been anchored was empty. She came to rest upside down in about 170 feet of water. So why has nobody ever gone back for her? The first reason is the one you would expect. Right after Baker, she was dangerously radioactive and she had never been reboarded, so nobody even knew how bad it was. Of dozens of target ships, only a handful were ever successfully decontaminated and sold for scrap. The rest were simply too hot to touch. And in the late 1940s, with the nuclear age barely a year old, there was no line of volunteers forming for that job. The second reason is geography. Bikini sits in the Marshall Islands, around 2,500 miles from Hawaii, and out there is nothing. No port, no shipbreaking yard, no heavy salvage equipment. Anyone wanting to raise her would have to ship every tool, every crane, every man across thousands of miles of open ocean before touching a single bolt. The cost of that alone is staggering. And then there is the third reason, and this is where the story turns genuinely ironic. Because the Nagato was built in 1920, her steel is what scientists call low background steel. Every piece of steel made after the first nuclear test in 1945 carries trace amounts of radioactive particles from atmospheric fallout. Steel made before that doesn't, and that makes it quietly valuable. It is used to build the shielding for sensitive instruments like radiation detectors, where even a whisper of background radiation would ruin the readings. Hospitals and research labs have actually salvaged plates from old warships for exactly this purpose. There is a real market for it. So follow the irony here. You have a battleship built from rare pre-nuclear steel that should, on paper, be worth recovering. And the one thing that destroyed that value was the radioactive seawater dumped onto her by the very nuclear test that sank her. The bomb that put the Nagato on the bottom also poisoned the only thing that might have justified bringing her back up. For comparison, the Americans once ran an actual feasibility study on the German cruiser Prinz Eugen back in 1974. The numbers came out at roughly $7.5 million to salvage, against a scrap value of only $1.5 million. Nobody seems to have ever bothered running those numbers for the Nagato, and that tells you everything. She is more than twice the tonnage of the Prinz Eugen, sitting deeper, much further away, upside down, and carrying a radiation question nobody ever resolved. The math was a lost cause before anyone even picked up a pencil, and now the moment to salvage her has passed entirely. In 2010, UNESCO declared Bikini Atoll a World Heritage Site for its place in the history of the nuclear age. The Marshall Islands opened the lagoon to divers back in 1996, and the Nagato has become one of the most celebrated wreck dives in the world, named by the Times of London as one of the 10 best on the planet. You descend past 4 enormous propellers, each over 13 feet across, all of them now pointing up toward the light. You can follow the entire length of the overturned hull, and you can swim into the bridge, the exact place where the order was given that pulled the United States into the war. The Marshall Islands owns the wreck now, and they are never going to let anyone take her apart. She is their most valuable dive site, a protected World Heritage location, and a war grave all at once. And for a ship this significant, that feels about right. So the Nagato is still there because she was too radioactive to approach when she sank, then too remote and too expensive to justify, then betrayed by the very blast that made her steel valuable, and finally, too historically important for anyone to dare touch. The most powerful battleship in the world the day she was launched. The ship from which Pearl Harbor was ordered. The only Japanese battleship to outlive the entire Second World War. And in the end, she capsized alone in the dark, and she has been resting upside down on the floor of a distant Pacific lagoon ever since. Nobody came back for her. Nobody is coming back for her. If you enjoyed this one and want to see more like it, Let me know in the comments and I'll cover more ships. Subscribe so you don't miss those, and I'll see you next time.